Okay, so welcome to this programming series. We are going to be learning how to basically store grades and then find the sum. So store grades in a data structure, in this case, an array. And we're using the JavaScript programming language. And then we're going to be finding the sum of those grades that are stored and entered by a user, and then find the average of those grades and also find the smallest or lowest value from those grades. So to get started, simply just JavaScript, so not JavaScript combined with HTML or with CSS, it's just JavaScript. What we are going to do is click on Create REPL, and we're going to create a template. This would be having node.js. It's actually this one. So, and then the title for this program is going to be called grades. So basically just grades, nothing else, because it's just based around grades. So grades, and then once you're ready, click on Create REPL. Now, the first thing to do is this is just JavaScript, so isolated from HTML and CSS. We want to create an array, so an array, so we can be able to store grades that the user is going to be entering, and we're going to ask the user how many grades they want to enter, and then we'll just store it to the array. So the first thing we're going to do is use the const keyword, which means constant, and then give our array a name. I'm going to call this array grades, okay? And this array is going to be empty. So don't forget that JavaScript, you have to end with a semicolon. I'm also going to create a variable called sum that's going to be used to calculate the sum of the grades that are stored in this array. And I'm going to set it to 0. So it's going to act like a counter. I'm going to create another variable called average that's just not going to be initialized to anything, but rather it's just going to calculate the average of all the grades stored in this grades array. So the first thing I want to do is to ask the user if they're ready to begin. So I'm going to just create another variable, and I'll just say ready, and then the question is going to be using this prompt keyword, and I'm like, are you ready to begin, right? Or are you ready to start entering grades? That's also a good way to say this. You need to specify how they should respond. So I'm going to say y/n, which is yes or no, and then a question mark, and I always like to just give spacing so their response is not too close to the question mark. Now, this is the part where I say if their response, so if the variable ready stores the response as yes, which is y, so if the response is yes, I open the parenthesis, and I'm basically going to start telling them to enter the grade. So I'm going to create a variable called grade. You can say var or you can say let. So anyone's also good. So I just like to use var because it reminds me of the whole variable thing. So variable is equal to, I'm going to prompt them to, first of all, I'm going to tell them how many grades they want to enter. So what's going to happen is I'm going to create a variable called grade number, and I will ask them how many grades they want to enter. So I'm going to prompt the question and say, how many grades would you like to enter? So how many grades do you want to store or enter? So question mark, and then just give a space again and a semicolon. So now that I have the number of grades that they want to enter and store in this array called grades, I'm just going to use a for loop to go like for that many number of times based on the number of grades they want to enter, and ask them to enter the grade and just store it in this grades array. So I'm going to use a for loop. I'm going to open parenthesis, and I'm going to say, I can say var again or let anyone you want. I'll use the variable I starting at 0, making sure that this variable I, and remember when we started at 0, it actually means the index positions of what's going to be stored in this grades array. So I'll explain that in a few minutes. So I is going to be less than the grade number. That means the number of grades they say they want to enter. It should be less than that. And then, of course, we're going to increment I by 1, so it becomes I++, which means it's actually I plus 1. So then after that, obviously, we have our curly brace. And this is a curly brace for the for loop, so don't get confused between curly braces. This is the curly brace that begins, this is the one that ends for this for loop. This is the curly brace that ends, and then of course begins for this if statement. So don't get confused, and make sure you have your curly braces closing and opening properly. So what I want to do is, now that we have this for loop, I want to explain how it's going to work. So imagine we have grades in here. So let's say, for example, I have 45, I have like 56, and I have 78. All of these grades inside of this array do have an index position. That means a position of where they're going to be stored. So for example, this one starts at an index position of 0. So that means the computer starts to count the positions of elements inside of this array, which is a data structure starting at 0, not like us that we start to count from 1. And then going to 1, and then going to 2, and so on. So if there's more grades, it's going to be 3 and 4, and so on. So if we want to fetch anything from this array, we have to know the index position of where it's stored for us to be able to get that particular grade. And that's going to help us because when we are trying to calculate the sum, we want to go from the first one and then we want to add it to the second and to the third. And for us to do that, we have to know the index positions, or at least allow the program to run by getting these values from this array using their own index positions. So yeah, that is about a little bit about index positions. Now getting back to where we are, we're now using this for loop so that we can repeat asking this user to enter the grade depending on the number of grades they want. So if they say they want like 4 grades, it means that this I is going to go from like I equals 0, I equal 1. So it's going to go like 0, 1, 2, and 3. And it's going to stop at 3 because it has to be less than the grade number. So if they entered 4 grades, so obviously 3 is less than 4, so we'll stop at 3. But essentially, it has counted the 4 grades because it started at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And so it counts the 4 grades that they want to enter. But just because it starts at 0, it stops at 3. If it started at 1, obviously, then it will go 1, 2, 3, and then 4. But because the computer starts to count at 0, this is the reason why it goes 0, 1, 2, and 3 and stops. So the for loop's going to repeat. Now what we're going to do is we're going to be asking the user to enter grade. So we're going to come, oops, sorry about that. There it is. Okay. So I'm going to just take this comment out to avoid any confusion. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the whole enter a grade thing. So I'm going to create another variable inside of the for loop. I'm going to call this grade. I'm going to prompt the user to enter a grade. So it's just going to be prompt and then open parenthesis, and it's just going to be enter a grade. If you want to just tell them enter grade 1, enter grade 2, you can also do it this way and say enter grade, and then you give like a space so it's not too close. And then outside here, you can just do like a plus sign, and then in brackets, you're going to say the I plus 1. And what this does is that it just basically it will tell them enter grade, and then remember I starts at 0, so 0 plus 1 is what? 1. So it's going to say enter grade 1. And so I becomes 1. And when I increases and becomes actually from 0 here, it becomes 1 by increasing, then it's going to be 1 plus 1, 2. So it's going to say enter grade 2, enter grade 3. So that's kind of how it's going to work until it says enter grade 4. So if you want to see how it works, we can just keep this as it is. So now we have to store this grade that they're entering. We have to keep it into our grades array. So I'm going to remove everything that was in there. We keep the array empty. So we're going to say grades, the name of our array, and we're going to use the push method so we can be able to push in this grade that they're entering and store it into this array. And then at the same time, we're going to be calculating the sum because as they're entering the grades that are going to be stored in this array, we want to be adding those grades to themselves to find the sum. And so we initially set the sum at 0, so we can say sum is equal. And there's one tricky thing about JavaScript is you cannot just directly say, plus grade and that's it. JavaScript, unlike Java, unlike Python and C++, it doesn't really specify the type of array, whether this array is storing an integer, and by default, the compiler, which is the software running the program, knows that it's integer, so therefore adds it as a number. So it doesn't specify if it's an integer or a string. So you have to kind of convert this, making sure you convert it to an integer because by default, it will be stored as a string. So you don't want to add a sum 0 to a string because if you add a 0 to a string, it's just going to add a 0 to the string. So even if I entered a grade as 3, it's just going to add a 0 to it and it will be like 0, 3. But it's not actually adding it. So if you wanted to add it as a number, you have to convert this string into an int using this parseInt method. So therefore, it's just going to convert the grade that they're entering as a variable because here you can see we're also not specifying the type of grade. unlike other programming languages where we could say this is an int or a float. So you have to convert what's received as a string into an integer using the parseInt method. So we can actually add the grades together as a sum. Now, once that is done, that is pretty much it. So you're going to go into the fact of now just basically calculating the average grade. So the average, which you already defined as a variable over here, you can just use it, is equal to the sum, obviously, divided by the number of grades. So we can say grades.length. That's another way to do it, which is grades.length, finding the length of things in this array. Or we could just say, sum divided by grades number, which is the one that, is the grade number, was the number of grades the user entered in the first place, which is the pretty easiest one. So the sum that is calculated from here by adding all the grades together will divide by the grade number, which is the number of grades that the user decided to enter and store in the array. And then finally, we're going to use the console.log so we can print out the sum and also print out the average actually. So console.log, we're going to say the average grade is, so quotation marks, and of course the sentence, the average grade is, and then, we give a space and we use this concatenation sign to separate our variable from our string. So now this is printing out the average, and now we are actually done. We're just going to do the last part, and the last part is to determine what the smallest value is from this set of arrays. From the set of arrays, sorry. So it's just one array. But remember that we also have to do the alternative of this, and the alternative is to find out if they're not ready to begin. So if they say no, for example, so we're going to come here and hit an enter, and we're going to say else if, you can say an else if, and basically that means if they say if the ready variable is equal to no, and they say they're not ready to begin, then in that case, we're just going to say, okay, we're going to use the console.log, which just prints out the output on the console, and we're just going to tell them, okay, thank you, and that's it. So something like that, So you always have to make sure you finish your blocks and never leave them incomplete. So this was the if block, and we just finished it with if it was like a no. And then else, you can do an else if you want, which means if they enter something other than a Y or an N, you can just tell them invalid input and they have to enter a yes or no. So you can say try again, enter only Y or N, and they know for sure that they just need to enter Y or N. So that's another good way to do what we call data validation. So we go back, and now that we've calculated the average of our grades, what about if we wanted to find the lowest score from the grades that were stored in this array? What we can do is inside of our yes again, so because they said yes, so the program calculates the lowest grade, we can just use a for loop again and go through this array that has the grades that have been entered now by the user, and we can go through all of those grades and compare between themselves and see which one's the smallest. So I'm just going to put a comment here and say finding the smallest grade, or the smallest, no, not the smallest, rather the lowest grade. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use a for loop. First, we have to create a variable so we can assign what the smallest grade is or the lowest grade is going to be. We can say that the lowest grade, lowest grade can be equal to 0. That's another thing. You can start it at 0. Or you can say that it should be equal to by default, to the first thing in this array. So if the grades were stored in the array as like 56 and like 89, and 32, what you're saying is that the lowest grade is going to be 0, which means it's going to be 56 by default starting, so that we can use that value to compare with the list and find which one's the lowest. So you have to set the lowest grade in the beginning, either to 0 or to the starting value in your array. Then we're going to use the for loop, and I'm going to use the let keyword this time, let a, which is like there. A is any variable, start at 0, and then a has to be less than the grades.length, like I told you, which basically would return the number of things or elements that are stored in the array, depending on how many things were initially collected from the user. So that just returns that size, and make sure that it doesn't go more than that size to basically compare and find what's the smallest value. So here I'm just gonna hit enter and close my curly brace. So now I have my for loop going for me. So it's going to start at 0, which means starting at the first thing stored inside of this array. And I already set my lowest grade to be the first thing. So we're going to be comparing the things that are in this array and seeing if it's lower than this. And if anything's lower than my starting value, then that's what we're going to be setting as the smallest or lowest grade. So here we're going to say if grades, okay, grades as in the array, if grades A, so we're comparing every value in this array. If it happens to be less than the lowest grade that we set in the beginning, then just make sure you spell this variable right. Then in that case, we're going to be setting the lowest grade to be equal to that particular grade. And I'm going to explain how that works. So, and then that's it. And so we set it to be equal to that. And one thing again to be careful with is that the grades again that you're getting from the array, remember, is by default as a string. So you want to make it an actual number so you can compare it to this lowest grade, which you have here set as a variable. So what you're going to do is you want to make all of them numbers so that you can actually compare them as numbers and not strings. So you're going to use the same parse int again method to be able to convert them into like numbers, like not as string or text that's stored in this array, but actual numbers so that the compiler can actually understand that you're saying if the first number, whatever that is in this array, is smaller than the lowest grade that we've set, which is by default starting with the first number. And if it is, then it means that lowest grade is going to be that particular grade from that array. If not, it's going to keep running and keep comparing until it gets to the smallest one. So I'm going to show how that essentially works. But once you finish this is all you need to do to find the smallest. And if you wanted to find the greatest grade or the highest one, you're just going to change this less than to greater than. That's all. So now we're going to come out of the for loop and we're going to do like a console.log, and then that's just going to print for us what the lowest grade is, saying that the lowest grade is, and it will just return whatever the lowest grade was. Now to explain how this works, again, I'll just break it down below here. Is basically it works like this. So if you had your array, which in this case is grades, and inside here you had like a couple, so let's say 34, and then let's say 98, and then maybe you had like a, maybe not that, 20, and then maybe you had like a 67, and then maybe you had like an 88, and then, and then maybe a 12, something like that. So let's say this is your array. Now, the for loop, what it's going to do is that it's first basically setting the lowest grade, okay, is setting it to the grade 0. And what is 0? Remember what I said, that everything you store in a data structure in an array has an index position. So this starts at 0. The computer starts to count this position of the 34 at 0. 98 is at 1. 20 is at 2, okay? And then 67 is at a 3 position, 88 is at a 4, and then 12 is at a 5. So essentially there are 6 things in here, but because the computer starts at 0, it reaches all the way to 5. So yeah, so these are the index positions. So what's happening here is that it's going to just be lowest grade. What we're doing is basically setting it to 34 because that's the one at 0 index position. So we started at that, and then the for loop, what it does is that it's first going to compare. It's going to take this first number because that's where we say grades. That's the part where we say if grades, right? That's what we wrote, grades, and then we put like an A. We said if it's lower than the lowest grade, and the lowest grade is 34, then it means we're setting the lowest grade to be equal to grade. So what's happening here is it's going to take the grades A, so starting with the first one, and so it's going to be asking, the compiler will be checking to see is 34, which is grade starting at A, and remember they start at index position, I'm going to say index position 0, starting position, right? And so A is going to be if grades A, which is now 0, is it less than the lowest grade? And what's the lowest grade? 34. And what's 0? 34 again. So is 34 less than 34? No. So what's going to happen is index position will increase by 1. Okay, so I wanted to show that it increases by 1. So now it changes to 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. So here it goes to the next one. Okay, so now it's grade, lowest grade is still 34. Remember, it didn't change. So now it goes grades 1, which is 98. Is 98 less than lowest grade, which is 34? Is 98 less than 34? That's kind of the question that the compiler is checking to see. Is it less than that? and it's obviously no. So, okay, that means, okay, now position, index position increases by 1 again, and now it becomes 2. So here it changes. So remember that lowest grade still stays at 34. So now it's at the second one, and that's 20. So it's going to say, okay, is 20 less than the lowest grade? Is 20 less than 34? That's the question's asking, and obviously that's a yes. So now the lowest grade is going to be equal to this grades A, which is at 2. So it's going to be equal to this 20. So that means our new lowest grade is now going to be 20. So it's no longer going to be 34 because we now found something that's smaller. And so this continues. So the lowest grade is now 20. So now this index increases by 1 again, so it becomes 3. We're taking the next one, 67. So now it becomes grades 3, which is at 67. So is 67 less than the lowest grade? And remember, the lowest grade is now 20. So 67 is not less than 20, so nothing happens here. So it goes back again, increases this by 1. Now this becomes 4. And so the grades, again, the position moves, and now it's at 88. Okay, so is 88 less than the lowest grade, which is still 20? No. So again, increase this by 1. And now it becomes what? 5, which is, again, the last one. Obviously, essentially 6, but 5 because it starts at 0. So what is 5? 12. Okay, is 12 less than the lowest grade, 20? Yes, it is. So that means this changes. Now the lowest grade is now going to be equal to 12. And that is what it will return back to you when it prints out on this section here of this console. So that's how the whole thing works. Okay, so that's the end of this program. So we've basically, just to zoom out a little, we have basically allowed the user to enter the grades into this array, and then we've been able to calculate the sum of these grades, and then we've been able to display the average, and finally we've been able to go through the grades that have been stored in this array and find the lowest grade. So now let's test it and run it and see how it works. So we go. Okay, so to run this up, I'm gonna click the rerun, and okay, it says how many grades do you want to enter? 3. I'm gonna go with 78, 23, 98. Okay, it's calculating the average grade, but there's a problem with the lowest grade, which is returning 78 instead of 23. And one thing I realized that I made a slight mistake in was, please don't close your parenthesis here that I said it converts everything to number. This is actually stored as a number. What it needs to do is convert just this one to number, just the grades A, which is taking the values from the array, but this one actually is going to be stored as a number. So if you can just take away that extra parenthesis and close this method for parse int here, so it just converts only this one to a number value, and that's what's going to be used to find the lowest grade. So now if you do that, you should be able to get your stuff going well, running properly. So I'm going to just click on a yes. How many grades? I'm going to do those same examples and then try doing a different example. So 23 and 98. So now it's returning for me the correct thing, lowest grade, once we made that little fix right here. So again, don't forget to close the brackets over here, and you don't need to close the brackets at the end here, because this is the one that needs to be converted to a number. Now let me run it and do some more examples. So I'm going to do like maybe 5 grades, and I'm just going to put like random stuff. So maybe I'll go with 34, like 98, like an 89, and maybe like a 12. And then maybe like 45. And so you see that it returns for me the average grade and also returns for me the lowest, which is 12. So it's working efficiently. Yeah, so that's the program. That's how it works.